Something is happening right now that the mainstream media is either misreporting or deliberately burying. 3 carrier strike groups, B-52 bombers repositioned to Diego Garcia, special operations assets quietly flowing into the Gulf region. These aren't routine deployments. The US military doesn't move this kind of hardware for a bluff. And anyone who's studied American force projection over the last 30 years knows exactly what this posture signals. We are not approaching a brink, we are standing on it. But here's what nobody's telling you. The why behind this buildup is far more consequential than the buildup itself. Because this isn't simply about Iran's nuclear program. This is about the final architecture of dollar dominance, the survival of the petrodollar system, and who gets to write the rules of the post-unipolar world. Iran, Russia, China, they've been quietly constructing an off-ramp from Western financial infrastructure for years, and Washington sees that clock running out. What you're about to hear isn't speculation, it's pattern recognition. And the pattern is unmistakable. Let me start where that pattern begins. Not in Tehran, not in Washington, but in a much quieter place. In the boardrooms of financial institutions, in the back channels of diplomatic cables, and in the slow, grinding realization among the architects of American foreign policy that something they built over 50 years is beginning to crack. To understand why American forces are massing around Iran right now, you have to understand what Iran actually represents to the existing global order. And I don't mean Iran the country, Iran the culture, or even Iran the military threat. I mean Iran as a symbol, as the last major holdout in a region that Washington has spent decades trying to fully bring under the umbrella of dollar-denominated energy trade. Because that umbrella, that system, what we loosely call the petrodollar, is the beating heart of American global dominance, and Iran has been outside of it, defiantly outside of it, since 1979. Think about what that means in practical terms. Every time Saudi Arabia sells a barrel of oil, that transaction flows through dollar-based systems. Every time Kuwait, the UAE, Iraq sells energy on the global market, the dollar is involved. That demand for dollars, that structural, systemic, unavoidable demand, is what allows the United States to run perpetual deficits, to print money, to fund its military at a scale no other nation on earth can match. It's not magic, it's architecture, and Iran sits outside that architecture. Iran has been trading energy in alternative currencies, building bilateral agreements with China, with Russia, with India. And that, more than any centrifuge, more than any enriched uranium, is the real threat that keeps people in Washington awake at night. Now here's where it gets genuinely important, because I want you to follow this carefully. The conversation in most American media right now is framed entirely around the nuclear issue. Iran is enriching uranium to 90%. Iran is weeks away from a weapon. Iran poses an existential threat to Israel. And look, none of that is entirely fabricated. Iran's nuclear program is real, it has advanced significantly, and it is a legitimate security concern for multiple parties in the region. But if you believe that nuclear weapons are the primary driver of what's happening right now with US force deployments, then you're reading the menu and missing the meal entirely. The timing of this escalation is not coincidental. Let me walk you through what's been happening in the broader geopolitical landscape over the past 18 months, because context is everything here. The BRICS expansion, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, Ethiopia, Egypt, that expansion represents something seismic. It represents the first serious institutionally coordinated challenge to the dollar-based international financial system since Bretton Woods, and when Saudi Arabia, the crown jewel of the petrodollar arrangement, starts accepting yuan for oil, starts deepening its relationships with Beijing, and starts appearing at BRICS summits, that sends a shockwave through every corridor of power in Washington, because if the Saudis are wavering, the entire architecture is in question, and Iran was formally welcomed into BRICS. Iran, the country that American foreign policy has treated as a pariah state for 4.5 decades, was welcomed into this emerging alternative bloc. That is not a small thing. That is a statement of intent from a significant portion of the world's population and economic output. It says, we are building something that does not require Washington's permission, and Washington's response, historically, predictably, almost mechanically, has always been the same: project force, create pressure, manufacture crisis. So let's talk about the actual military situation, because I want to be precise here rather than alarmist. The deployments we are seeing are real and they are substantial. The USS Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group has been in the region. Additional air assets have been repositioned. There have been confirmed movements of long-range strike-capable bombers. The Pentagon has authorized expanded rules of engagement for forces in proximity to Iranian assets. These are not peacetime rotations. The logistics footprint required to sustain this kind of presence is enormous, and you don't spend that kind of money, you don't move that kind of hardware unless you are either prepared to use it or you are engaged in a very serious coercive signaling operation. And the question that matters is, which one is it this time? Here's what I think is actually happening, and bear with me because this requires holding several things in your mind simultaneously. There is a faction within the American national security establishment that genuinely believes a military strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure is not only necessary but overdue. These are people who look at the trajectory of Iran's enrichment program and conclude that the window for a viable military option is closing. Once Iran has a functional nuclear deterrent, even a crude one, the entire strategic calculus changes permanently. You cannot bomb a nuclear-armed state the way you can bomb a conventionally armed one. So from their perspective, if it's going to happen, it has to happen now or it doesn't happen at all. But there's another faction, and this faction is larger than most people realize, that understands the catastrophic risk of what an actual war with Iran would look like. Iran is not Iraq in 2003. Iran is not Libya. Iran is not even close to those scenarios. Iran has a population of nearly 90 million people. It has a deeply entrenched, battle-hardened military establishment. It has the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which has spent decades preparing asymmetric warfare capabilities specifically designed to counter American conventional superiority. It has Hezbollah in Lebanon, armed with over 100,000 missiles. It has proxy networks across Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. An American strike on Iran does not end Iranian capability. It triggers a regional war of a scale and duration that nobody in Washington can confidently predict or control. And then there's the global economic dimension, which in my view is perhaps the most underappreciated risk of all. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow choke point between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, handles roughly 20% of the world's oil supply, 20%. Iran has explicitly and repeatedly stated that any military attack on Iranian soil will result in the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, whether they can actually sustain that closure is debatable, but even a temporary disruption, even 2 or 3 weeks of genuine uncertainty about oil flows through that strait, would send energy prices into a spiral that would hit the American economy at a moment when it is already carrying extraordinary debt loads, already dealing with persistent inflationary pressure, and already watching its political cohesion fray at the edges. So when you ask why we're at this moment, you have to hold all of this together. You have the nuclear clock, you have the petrodollar erosion, you have the BRICS challenge, you have the Israeli pressure, and Israeli pressure is real and significant here, because Israel views a nuclear Iran as genuinely existential in a way that American policymakers sometimes do and sometimes don't, depending on who's in power. You have the domestic political calculations in Washington, and you have the broader question of American credibility in a world that is increasingly skeptical that American power means what it used to mean. Let me spend a moment on the Israeli dimension because it's crucial and it's often either over-dramatized or under-explained. Israel has been striking Iranian assets in Syria, in Iraq, inside Iran itself, with increasing frequency and decreasing pretense of deniability. The strike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus earlier this year was a significant escalation. Iran's response, the unprecedented direct strike on Israeli territory using ballistic missiles and drones, was itself a historic moment. For the first time in the history of the conflict between these two states, Iran struck Israel directly from Iranian soil. That crossed a threshold, and Israel's calculation since that moment has been relatively straightforward. The deterrence architecture that kept this conflict in the shadows for decades has been altered, and if deterrence has changed, strategy must change with it. Israel has been pushing hard for American commitment to a joint operation against Iran's nuclear sites, and the American response has been complicated because the Americans understand the escalation ladder in a way that Israeli planners sometimes discount. Yes, Israel can strike, Israel has the aircraft, the munitions, the intelligence, but Israel cannot sustain a prolonged campaign against Iran alone. Israel cannot project the kind of sustained air power required to truly degrade Iran's nuclear infrastructure, much of which is deeply buried. That requires American B-2 bombers, that requires bunker-busting munitions that only the United States possesses, and that means American involvement. And American involvement means American consequences. Now, I want to bring this back to something that I think is the deepest layer of what we're watching, because beyond the military calculus, beyond the nuclear question, beyond even the petrodollar, there is a moral and civilizational argument being made right now, and it's being made by multiple sides simultaneously. The American foreign policy establishment, or at least its more hawkish wing, genuinely believes that a world with a nuclear Iran is a more dangerous, less stable world. And there's a reasonable argument for that. I'm not dismissing it. Nuclear proliferation is genuinely dangerous, and the Middle East is not a region with a lot of institutional resilience for managing nuclear standoffs. But the other argument, the argument being made quietly in Moscow, loudly in Beijing, and with increasing confidence across the global south, is that the United States does not have the moral authority to decide which nations can and cannot have nuclear weapons while itself possessing thousands of them, while covering for an Israeli nuclear arsenal that has never been officially acknowledged, and while having used the threat of military force as a diplomatic instrument for decades. That argument resonates. It resonates deeply in places that have watched American military interventions produce not stability but chaos, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, in Afghanistan. The credibility deficit that America carries into this crisis is real, and it matters because it affects how every other actor on the board responds. Here's what I think the next several months look like, and I want to be honest that this is analysis, not prophecy. The most likely near-term scenario is continued pressure without direct military engagement. The deployments are real, but they serve a coercive function. They are meant to signal to Tehran that the cost of continued nuclear advancement is existential, and to signal to allies that America remains committed. Whether that coercion works depends entirely on how Tehran reads American resolve, and Tehran has decades of experience reading American bluffs. The Iranians have watched this movie before. They watched it in 2012, in 2018, in 2020. Each time, the pressure mounted, the rhetoric escalated, and then something shifted. A negotiation opened, a calculation changed, the moment passed. But, and this is the part I want you to sit with, each cycle of escalation and de-escalation has left the underlying tension more compressed, not less. Iran's nuclear program is more advanced today than it was in 2015 when the JCPOA was signed. It is more advanced than it was when Trump withdrew from that agreement in 2018. It is more advanced than it was in 2020. The trajectory is clear, and at some point, the window for any kind of negotiated resolution closes, not because either side is necessarily determined to fight, but because the facts on the ground make a negotiated outcome structurally unavailable. That is the knife edge we are approaching. There is also the wild card of internal Iranian politics, which Western analysis tends to oversimplify into a binary of hardliners versus moderates. The reality is more nuanced. There are factions within the Iranian system that would genuinely welcome a deal, that understand the economic cost of sanctions, that see the suffering of the Iranian middle class, that want Iran to be a normal integrated economy. And there are factions that have built their entire institutional identity around resistance, around the narrative of besieged sovereignty, around the ideological framework that requires an adversarial relationship with Washington. A military strike would not weaken the second faction, it would annihilate the first. It would do for Iranian hardliners what 9/11 did for American hawks, create a political environment so charged with fear and anger and nationalism that no moderate voice can survive in it. And perhaps most importantly, perhaps the thing I want you to carry out of this conversation today, Uddadzin, is this. The world is watching, not just watching to see whether America strikes Iran or doesn't strike Iran. The world is watching to see whether the rules-based international order that America built and claimed to champion is a real thing or a convenient fiction. Because if a nuclear-armed America allied with a nuclear-armed Israel strikes a non-nuclear weapon state because that state might develop nuclear weapons, while other nuclear-armed states face no such threat, then the message received in Pyongyang, in Riyadh, in Ankara, in Jakarta, in every capital that has ever been told that American security guarantees are sufficient, is very simple. The message is, get your own deterrent, get it now, because the alternative is vulnerability. That is the cascading consequence that nobody in Washington wants to talk about publicly, but that serious analysts understand intimately. A strike on Iran that prevents an Iranian nuclear weapon in the short term could trigger a wave of nuclear proliferation that makes the world of 2035 look nothing like the world of 2025. That is not a comfortable thought, but it is a real one. What we are watching right now is not simply a military standoff. It is the visible surface of a much deeper structural crisis. A crisis about who has power, who gets to exercise it, and on what moral basis. The United States is not simply deciding whether to bomb Iran. It is deciding what kind of power it wants to be in a world that is no longer automatically organized around American preferences. And that decision, whatever form it takes, will shape the next 30 years of global history in ways that will touch every American life, every American institution, and every American who is trying to make sense of a world that seems to be moving faster than anyone can fully explain. This is the conversation we should be having, and it starts with understanding what is actually at stake.